It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Eleanor Sterling laughed as she deliberately tipped her champagne flute over Clara Vance's hand-me-down dress in front of the city's most influential donors. The pale vintage silk, which had belonged to Clara's mother, darkened instantly as the expensive liquid soaked into the fabric. A few people in the immediate circle gasped, but the sound was quickly drowned out by Eleanor's sharp, melodic titter. "Oh, Clara, I am so sorry," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with a mock concern that didn't reach her cold, blue eyes. "I suppose I'm just not used to seeing such absorbent material at a black tie gala. Is that polyester? It's a wonder it didn't just melt off your back." Julian Sterling stepped up beside his sister, adjusting his silk bow tie with a smirk that mirrored hers. He didn't offer a napkin or a word of comfort. Instead, he looked at the stain and then at the nearby service table. "Since you're already dressed for a mess, Clara, why don't you make yourself useful? The catering staff is short-handed in the West Wing. I'm sure they could use someone with your humble background to clear the shrimp cocktail trays." Clara stood perfectly still. She could feel the cold weight of the champagne clinging to her skin, the scent of fermented grapes and expensive oud perfume clogging her senses. The grand ballroom of the Sterling estate was a cathedral of excess, all white marble, crystal chandeliers, and the cloying fragrance of 10,000 imported lilies. To everyone else in the room, she was the charity case, the girl the Sterlings had taken in out of the goodness of their hearts after her father's death. She looked past the siblings to Aunt Beatrix, who sat in a velvet armchair a few yards away. The elderly matriarch's face was a mask of practiced indifference, but her knuckles were white as she gripped her cane. She was the only one who knew the truth about the Sterling fortune, and the only one who knew exactly what Clara was capable of when pushed. "I'll take care of it," Clara said, her voice low and steady. It was the voice of a woman who spent 40 hours a week untangling the web of lies hidden in corporate ledgers. As a forensic auditor, she knew that the loudest people in the room were usually the ones with the most to hide. "That's a good girl," Eleanor sneered, leaning in so close that Clara could smell the mint on her breath. "Don't forget to check the bathrooms for paper towels while you're at it. You've always had such a talent for finding things that don't belong." Eleanor turned her back, her designer gown shimmering like fish scales under the chandeliers, and began regaling a group of investors with a story about her recent trip to the Maldives. Julian followed her, his laughter joining the general roar of the party. They were so confident in their untouchable status, so sure that Clara was nothing more than a ghost in their hallways. Clara turned away from the light, walking toward the shadows of the service corridor. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble, a rhythmic, predatory sound that no one noticed over the string quartet. She reached into the small, beaded clutch at her waist and felt the cold, hard edge of her encrypted smartphone. 2 minutes later, she was in the darkened library. The heavy oak doors muffled the sounds of the gala. She didn't head for the sink to scrub the stain. Instead, she walked to the massive mahogany desk and pulled a hidden folder from her bag, the one she had spent 6 months compiling. She opened the gala's commemorative program, looking at the Sterling Foundation financial summary printed on the back page. To the untrained eye, it looked like a record of staggering generosity. To Clara, it was a roadmap of fraud. She saw the discrepancies immediately: the missing 3% in the overhead, the shell companies listed as vendors, the signatures that didn't quite match the legal filings she had pulled from the state archives. Eleanor thought she was an identity thief, but Clara was the one who had spent years watching Eleanor siphon funds from Aunt Beatrix's private accounts to pay for those Maldives trips. Julian thought he was an enabler, but Clara knew he was the one signing the forged checks. Her phone buzzed in her hand. It was a message from Marcus Thorne. "The filing is ready. We just need your word." Clara looked down at the champagne stain on her mother's dress. It was a ruin, a mark of their contempt. They had spent a decade trying to erase her, treating her like a servant in the house her own father had helped build. They thought she was a mouse, hiding in the walls, grateful for the crumbs they dropped. She didn't feel like a mouse. She felt like a lion that had finally stopped pretending to sleep. She typed a single word back to Marcus: proceed. The Sterlings believed in inheritance, in the divine right of their name. They didn't realize that the most powerful thing her father had left her wasn't a seat at their table, but the founder's veto, a legal clause buried so deep in the original incorporation papers that Julian and Eleanor hadn't even bothered to read them. Aunt Beatrix had kept the secret for 20 years, waiting for the moment the siblings became truly irredeemable. That moment had just arrived with a splash of champagne. Clara walked back to the door, pausing to check her reflection in the gilded mirror. The stain was still there, ugly and dark against the silk. She didn't try to hide it. She smoothed her hair, straightened her shoulders, and walked back out into the light. The countdown had begun. In 48 hours, the Sterlings would be hosting a board meeting to celebrate their new acquisition. They didn't know that Clara Vance was no longer auditing their past. She was about to audit their future out of existence. As she re-entered the ballroom, she caught Eleanor's eye across the room. Eleanor raised her glass in a mocking toast. Clara didn't flinch. She simply nodded, a small, cold smile playing on her lips. The Ice Queen was about to find out exactly how quickly a kingdom could melt. The next morning, the Sterling estate felt like a tomb of gilded secrets. Clara Vance sat in the mahogany-paneled library, the scent of lemon polish and old leather heavy in the air. Her fingers traced the edge of a ledger, not the digital ones the board saw, but the physical backups Aunt Beatrix had whispered about in the garden weeks ago. The sun through the stained glass windows cast fractured red light across the pages, making the ink look like fresh blood. Julian Sterling strode in, the sharp, metallic scent of his expensive cologne preceding him like a warning. He didn't look at her. He looked at the silver coffee service on the side table. "It's cold, Clara. Fix it, will you? The staff is busy preparing for tomorrow's celebration." He tossed a thick manila envelope onto the desk, the heavy paper nearly clipping her hand. Julian didn't wait for a response. He leaned against the doorframe, checking his gold Rolex with the casual indifference of a man who owned the minutes of everyone around him. "And sign those. They're the transfer papers for the offshore holdings. Eleanor wants them finalized before the board meeting tomorrow at 10. Clara didn't reach for the coffee. She reached for the envelope. Inside were the documents Eleanor Sterling had used to siphon the inheritance, the very funds meant for the Sterling Foundation. Julian smirked, his eyes scanning her modest blouse with visible disdain. "Don't bother reading the fine print. You wouldn't understand the legalities anyway. Just be the good little sister we rescued from the gutter and do as you're told." Clara felt the phantom weight of the founder's veto in her mind, a legal ghost her father had left her, one that Julian and Eleanor believed had been incinerated years ago. She looked up, her expression a mask of professional neutrality. "Tomorrow at 10, that's a tight deadline, Julian. The acquisition happens at noon. We need the board's unanimous consent by then," he said, his voice dripping with unearned authority. "Make yourself useful for once. That dress you wore last night." Eleanor said the help couldn't even scrub the stain out. A waste of good silk, really. Then again, you never did know how to carry yourself in high society. As Julian left, the heavy oak door clicking shut with a sound like a gavel, Clara pulled a burner phone from her pocket. She dialed a number she had committed to memory years ago. "Marcus Thorne," a gravelly voice answered on the second ring. "I have the signatures, Marcus," Clara whispered, her voice steady. "Not mine, theirs. They've just handed me the evidence of the shell company transfers. They think I'm just filing them into the archive." "And the veto?" Marcus asked, the sound of rustling paper audible on his end. Clara glanced at the safe hidden behind a portrait of the Sterling patriarch. The cold, metallic tang of the safe's handle seemed to vibrate in the air. "Aunt Beatrix gave me the code this morning. The original articles of incorporation are still there. The ones Eleanor thought she burned. It's all here, Marcus. Every lie they've told since the funeral. If you use that veto tomorrow, Clara, there's no going back. You'll be declaring war on the only family you have left." "They didn't raise me," Clara said, her voice like a sharpening blade. "They caged me. Tomorrow I'm letting myself out." She spent the next 3 hours scanning every page. The paper was crisp, the ink smelling of fresh deception. Every signature from Julian and Eleanor was a nail in their own coffin. She could almost feel the momentum shifting, the power dynamic in the house tilting on its axis. A shadow fell across the desk. Eleanor stood there, draped in cream cashmere that cost more than a year of Clara's salary. She didn't speak at first, merely swiped a manicured finger across the mahogany desk, checking for dust. "I hope you're not getting ideas, Clara," Eleanor said, her voice a polished blade. "Julian mentioned you were asking questions about the acquisition during the gala. Remember your place. You're the auditor because I allow it. One word from me, and you're back in that one-bedroom apartment with the leaking ceiling and the debt collectors." Eleanor leaned in, her eyes cold as Arctic ice, the faint scent of her floral perfume suddenly suffocating. "Tomorrow is our coronation. Don't trip over your own feet again." It would be a shame to lose everything over a little bit of curiosity. Clara watched her walk away, the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of her stilettos on the marble hallway sounding like a countdown. 24 hours. Clara picked up the pen. She didn't sign the transfer papers. Instead, she wrote a single name on a sticky note and pressed it to the top of the file. Founder. The countdown had reached its final cycle. Tomorrow, the Ice Queen would find out exactly who owned the throne she was sitting on. 3 hours after the gala ended, the city was a blur of neon and rain against the window of Marcus Thorne's private study. The room smelled of old leather and the sharp, metallic tang of an espresso machine humming in the corner. Clara Vance sat in a high-backed chair, her coat still damp from the trek across the parking lot. She watched as the attorney adjusted his spectacles, the light from his desk lamp catching the silver at his temples. Marcus Thorne slid a heavy, cream-colored folder across the mahogany desk. He didn't speak immediately, letting the weight of the documents settle between them. "The paper trail is ironclad, Clara," he finally said, his voice a low baritone that carried the weight of 20 years in corporate litigation. Eleanor was thorough, but she was arrogant. She assumed no one would ever look at the original incorporation blueprints from 30 years ago. She thought she'd buried the founder's veto under 3 decades of digital signatures and shell company transfers. Clara opened the folder. Her fingers traced the embossed seal of the original Sterling holdings, the paper feeling thick and slightly abrasive under her touch. This was it, the weapon she had spent months hunting for. It wasn't just a contract. It was a death warrant for Eleanor's ambitions. The document explicitly stated that any acquisition exceeding 40% of the company's valuation required the unanimous consent of the founder's bloodline. "She's been operating under the assumption that Julian was the sole heir to that bloodline," Marcus continued, leaning forward into the circle of light. "She spent years forging the adoption records to show that you were merely a ward of the estate with no legal claim. But Aunt Beatrix kept the original hospital filings. You aren't just an auditor, Clara. You are the majority stake." The phone on the desk vibrated, the harsh, buzzing sound echoing in the quiet room. Clara glanced at the screen, Julian Sterling. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She could almost hear his sneering tone through the glass. He was likely calling to remind her of the 8 o'clock deadline, his voice dripping with the casual cruelty he'd perfected since they were children. "Let it ring," she said softly. Her heart didn't race. For the first time in her life, the fear that usually coiled in her stomach at the sound of his voice was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. She looked at Marcus. "Does this hold up if they try to sign the merger tomorrow morning?" "It doesn't just hold up," Marcus replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "It freezes every asset they have. The moment you present this to the board, the acquisition becomes a federal crime. Eleanor isn't just looking at a lost deal. She's looking at identity theft and securities fraud." Clara stood, tucking the folder into her briefcase. The click of the latches felt like a gavel striking a bench. "I have one more stop to make tonight." The drive back to the Sterling estate took 40 minutes. The rain had turned into a steady, rhythmic drumming against the roof of her car. When Clara stepped into the grand foyer, she was met not with silence, but with the sound of tearing fabric and the heavy thud of wood hitting marble. Eleanor Sterling stood at the top of the stairs, her silk robe billowing behind her like a shroud. She wasn't alone. Two maids stood nearby, their faces pale and eyes averted as they hauled Clara's modest suitcases toward the landing. With a flick of her wrist, Eleanor sent a stack of Clara's books tumbling over the railing. They hit the floor with a series of sharp cracks, the spines snapping. "I told you to be gone by morning," Eleanor said, her voice echoing through the cavernous hall. She descended the stairs slowly, her heels clicking against the stone with the precision of a metronome. "But I find I can't stand the smell of your desperation in my house for one more hour. You're a charity case that stayed too long, Clara. A parasite that finally ran out of blood to suck." Clara didn't flinch as a stray photograph, a picture of her mother, fluttered down to land at her feet, the glass frame shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. She looked up at the woman who had spent years trying to erase her existence. Eleanor looked radiant even in her malice, her skin pale and perfect, her eyes shining with the predatory glee of a victor. "You're making a mess, Eleanor," Clara said, her voice remarkably steady. She didn't reach for the photo. She didn't move to save her belongings. She simply stood in the center of the foyer, a small figure against the backdrop of the Sterling's stolen opulence. "I'm cleaning," Eleanor corrected, stopping on the final step. She leaned in, the scent of her expensive, cloying floral perfume filling the space between them. "Julian and I are the future of this name. You are a footnote, a mistake my father made that I am finally correcting. Go back to your leaking ceiling and your debt collectors. You don't belong in this zip code, let alone this family." She reached out, her manicured fingers plucking a stray thread from Clara's coat with a look of pure disgust. "Don't bother showing up tomorrow. Security has already been given your physical description. If you even touch the sidewalk in front of the building, you'll be arrested for trespassing." Clara looked at the shattered glass by her shoes, then back at Eleanor. She felt the weight of the briefcase in her hand, the weight of the truth Marcus Thorne had just validated. She thought of the board members who would be sitting in high-backed chairs in exactly 10 hours, waiting for the Ice Queen to deliver her coronation speech. "I'll remember that," Clara said. She turned toward the door, leaving her scattered belongings on the floor. She didn't need them. Everything she truly owned was already in her hand. As she stepped back out into the rain, she heard Julian's voice from the balcony above, laughing as he called out a final insult about her pitiful exit. Clara didn't look back. She sat in her car, the clock on the dashboard glowing a soft, steady green. 060000. The countdown had moved from days to hours. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, encrypted burner phone Marcus had provided. She dialed a single number. "It's me," she said as the line connected. "The archive is secure. Inform the board we have a late addition to the agenda. A matter of founding lineage." She ended the call and watched the lights of the Sterling mansion in her rearview mirror. They looked fragile now, like a house of cards caught in a rising wind. 10 hours until the board meeting. 10 hours until the Ice Queen realized she wasn't standing on a throne, but on a trapdoor. Clara shifted the car into gear and drove into the dark. The folder on the passenger seat hummed with the power to tear a dynasty apart. The day before the event, the Sterling estate felt less like a home and more like a stage being set for a tragedy. Clara Vance walked through the grand foyer, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs that cost more than the average auditor's annual salary. The air inside the mansion was chilled to a precise 68 degrees, carrying the faint, sharp scent of lemon polish and the bitter aroma of high-altitude espresso. She wasn't there to gather more evidence. Marcus Thorne had already confirmed the file was airtight. She was there for a different reason. She was there to offer mercy. She found Eleanor Sterling in the solarium, surrounded by blooming white orchids that looked as fragile and cold as the woman tending them. Eleanor didn't look up as Clara approached. She simply reached out with a pair of silver shears and snipped a dead leaf, the metallic snip echoing against the glass walls. "The help usually enters through the rear, Clara," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with the effortless cruelty that had once made Clara flinch. She finally turned, her eyes sweeping over Clara's modest charcoal suit with visible revulsion. "You smell like audit paperwork and desperation. It's quite distracting." Clara didn't move. She felt the weight of the encrypted burner phone in her pocket, a silent tether to the power she now held. "I'm not here as your employee, Eleanor, and I'm certainly not here as your charity case." Eleanor let out a short, jagged laugh, the sound of glass grinding on stone. She set the shears down on a marble-topped table and stepped closer, the cloying scent of her expensive jasmine perfume filling the space between them. "Then why are you here? If you've come to beg for your position back after your little disappearing act, save your breath. Julian is already drafting the press release regarding your mental instability." "I'm here to give you a choice," Clara said, her voice dropping to a level of calm that made Eleanor's eyes flicker with a momentary, confused shadow. "Resign. Cite health reasons, exhaustion, whatever lie suits your ego. Step down from the board today, return the funds you diverted from the legacy accounts, and I'll ensure the authorities see it as a voluntary restitution." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant hum of the estate's climate control. Eleanor's face went through a rapid succession of expressions: shock, amusement, and finally, a mask of pure, unadulterated arrogance. She leaned in, her voice a venomous whisper. "You think you have teeth, little mouse? You've spent too much time staring at spreadsheets. I'm a Sterling. You are a footnote in a ledger I've already closed." "I know about the identity theft, Eleanor," Clara said softly. "I know about the signatures you forged on Aunt Beatrix's medical proxies to bypass the trust's oversight. And I know about the founder's veto." Eleanor froze. The color didn't leave her face, she was too well practiced for that. But her hand, resting on the marble table, tightened until her knuckles turned a ghostly white. Before she could respond, the heavy oak doors of the solarium swung open. Julian Sterling stepped in, looking every bit the entitled heir in his tailored Italian blazer. He was holding a glass of amber liquid, his smirk widening as he saw Clara. "Still here. I thought security had cleared out the trash." He walked over to Eleanor, placing a hand on her shoulder in a show of solidarity that felt entirely performative. "Clara, I've decided to be generous. If you leave now and sign a non-disclosure agreement, I'll write you a check for $50,000. It's more than you'd make in 3 years of looking for mistakes that don't exist." Clara looked at him, then back at Eleanor. The dramatic irony was almost palpable. They were standing on a trapdoor, mocking the person holding the lever. "Keep your money, Julian. You're going to need it for the legal fees." "Enough of this," Eleanor snapped, her composure snapping back into place like a whip. "You have nothing but theories and bitterness. Tomorrow at the board meeting, I will be confirmed as the permanent chairperson. You, meanwhile, will be lucky if you aren't escorted out in handcuffs for attempted extortion." Clara nodded slowly, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. She had offered the mercy. It had been rejected with the expected level of Sterling hubris. "I suppose we'll see who belongs at that table tomorrow morning." As she turned to leave, she caught sight of Aunt Beatrix watching from the shadows of the hallway, her pale face unreadable. Clara didn't stop. She walked out of the mansion and into the cooling evening air. She reached into her bag and touched the corner of the heavy archive folder. The countdown was no longer in hours, it was in heartbeats. The Ice Queen was convinced she was invincible, but as Clara drove away, she knew the sun was about to rise on a very long, very hot day. One more night. One more night of lies before the Sterling dynasty learned the true cost of their arrogance. The evening of the Vanguard Gala arrived with a suffocating, perfume-heavy heat that even the museum's industrial cooling systems couldn't quite suppress. Standing beneath the towering sandstone blocks of the Temple of Dendur, Clara Vance felt the weight of the night before pressing against her ribs. She had spent the last 12 hours in a windowless room with Marcus Thorne, verifying the final chain of custody for the Sterling family's original charter. Now, dressed in a floor-length gown of midnight silk that she had purchased with her own savings, she stood in the center of the lion's den. Eleanor Sterling was already holding court near the reflecting pool. She looked every bit the dynastic heir in a shimmering silver sheath that caught the light like armor. Her laughter, sharp and melodic, carried across the water, drawing the eyes of every board member and donor in the room. She was the sun around which this entire social solar system orbited, and she knew it. "There she is," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the hum of the string quartet as she spotted Clara. She didn't move toward her. She waited for Clara to cross the distance, a silent demand for subservience. A group of 3 women in heavy diamonds turned in unison, their gazes sweeping over Clara with the practiced indifference of the ultra-wealthy. "Clara, dear," Eleanor continued, her smile not reaching her eyes. She reached out, her fingers, cold and smelling of expensive gardenia, brushing against the fabric of Clara's sleeve. "I must say black is so practical. It hides the stains of hard work, doesn't it? Though I'm surprised you found the time to shop between your little extortion fantasies." The women in the circle tittered. It was a calculated strike, delivered with the casual cruelty Eleanor had perfected over a lifetime. Clara felt the familiar sting of public humiliation, the heat rising in her neck as the witnesses exchanged knowing glances. "I find that black is more appropriate for a transition, Eleanor," Clara replied, her voice steady. She didn't pull away. She met the older woman's gaze with a calm that seemed to unsettle the Ice Queen for a fleeting second. "It's a color of finality." Eleanor's lip curled. "It's the color of a funeral, which is exactly what your career will look like by noon tomorrow. I've already spoken to the ethics committee. They're fascinated by your sudden interest in family archives." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a hiss that only the immediate circle could hear. "You are a charity case who forgot her place. I gave you a seat at our table out of pity, and you tried to bite the hand that fed you. Enjoy the champagne, Clara. It's the last thing you'll ever taste on the Sterling tab." Julian Sterling appeared at his sister's elbow, looking flushed and triumphant. He adjusted his silk bow tie, his eyes darting to Clara with a mixture of contempt and nervous energy. "The board is all here, Elle. They're ready for the pre-announcement toast. Mr. Henderson is asking for you." He didn't even acknowledge Clara's presence, treating her as if she were part of the museum's architecture. As the siblings turned to lead their entourage toward the raised dais, Clara felt a presence at her shoulder. Marcus Thorne stood there, his tuxedo perfectly tailored, his expression unreadable to anyone who didn't know him. He didn't look at her. He looked at the reflecting pool, but his hand briefly brushed hers. "The filing is confirmed," Marcus whispered, the words barely a breath. "The court-ordered injunction is sitting on the chairperson's desk at the office, and a digital copy was sent to the entire board's private server 3 minutes ago. The countdown has hit 0, Clara." Clara took a slow breath, the scent of floor wax and lilies suddenly sharper. She looked across the room and saw Aunt Beatrix sitting in a velvet armchair near the exit. The matriarch looked frail, her pale face a mask of sorrow, but she caught Clara's eye and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The witness was ready. "She has no idea," Clara murmured. "Arrogance is a blindfold," Marcus replied. "She's so busy looking at her own reflection that she hasn't noticed the water is rising." The lights in the great hall dimmed slightly, a signal for the evening's formal proceedings to begin. Eleanor stepped onto the dais, the silver of her dress gleaming under the spotlights. She took a crystal flute from a passing waiter, the clink of the glass against her rings sounding like a bell. The room fell into an expectant silence. This was the moment the Sterling dynasty had spent decades preparing for, the formal handoff of the empire from the old guard to the new. Clara moved through the crowd, positioning herself near the front of the stage. She could feel the eyes of the board members on her, men and women who had ignored her for years, now sensing a shift in the atmosphere. Mr. Henderson, the board chair, looked particularly gray, his gaze flickering between Eleanor and the smartphone he held tightly in his left hand. He had clearly seen the notification. Eleanor raised her glass, her posture regal. "Tonight, we celebrate more than just a company," she began, her voice projecting with effortless authority. "We celebrate a legacy, a lineage of strength that began with my grandfather and continues through the blood that flows in this room tonight. Some believe that power can be earned through spreadsheets and audits, but true leadership is a birthright. She paused, her eyes locking onto Clara's in the front row. The smirk she wore was one of absolute victory. She was enjoying this, the public dismissal of the woman she considered a bug beneath her heel. "To the future of Sterling Global," Eleanor announced, her voice ringing out, "and to the wisdom of knowing exactly where you belong." As the crowd raised their glasses, Clara didn't move. She didn't drink. She simply watched as Mr. Henderson stepped forward, his face ashen, and placed a hand on Eleanor's arm before she could take a sip. The room went deathly quiet. The toast hung in the air, unfinished, as the board chair leaned in to whisper something that made the silver glass tremble in Eleanor's hand. Clara reached into her small clutch and felt the cool, hard edge of the flash drive. The storm hadn't just arrived. It was already inside the building. The silver glass in Eleanor Sterling's hand began to rattle against her rings. The sound was a frantic, metallic chatter that cut through the sudden, suffocating silence of the ballroom. Mr. Henderson stepped back, his face a mask of professional disgust, leaving her standing alone under the spotlight. The toast she had prepared died in her throat, replaced by a sharp, audible hitch in her breathing. Clara Vance didn't wait for her to recover. She walked toward the front of the room, her heels clicking against the marble with the steady rhythm of a ticking clock. The guests, who seconds ago had been prepared to worship at the altar of the Sterling name, now parted like the Red Sea. Clara felt the cool, hard edge of the flash drive in her palm, the weight of 10 years of silence finally ready to be dropped. "Security," Eleanor finally found her voice, though it was thin and brittle. "Someone remove this woman. She's trespassing. She's a disgruntled former clerk trying to make a scene." She looked toward the back of the room, expecting the heavy-set men in suits to descend. They didn't move. Marcus Thorne stood beside the AV booth, his arms crossed, his expression one of cold, clinical victory. He gave a single, sharp nod to the technician. The massive LED screens behind the podium flickered. The promotional video of the new Sterling headquarters vanished, replaced by a high-resolution scan of a document that made the air leave the room. It wasn't just a bank statement or a forged wire transfer. It was the original charter of Sterling Global, bearing the ancient, purple wax seal of the founder's veto. The transformation in Eleanor was visceral. The regal tilt of her chin vanished as her neck seemed to lose its ability to support her head. Her skin, usually a masterpiece of expensive creams and porcelain foundation, curdled into a sickly, grayish pallor that made her look 20 years older in a heartbeat. Her eyes didn't just widen. They became frantic, darting globes of white as she stared at the screen, her pupils shrinking to pinpricks of pure, unadulterated terror. Her mouth hung open, her lower lip trembling with a wet, rhythmic twitch that destroyed every ounce of her carefully cultivated dignity. The haughty curve of her lips collapsed into a jagged, trembling line. Her breathing became a series of ragged, audible hitches, her chest heaving against the silk of her gown, as if the very air in the ballroom had turned to poison. The silver glass finally slipped from her numb fingers, shattering against the marble with a sound like a gunshot. Julian Sterling stood frozen 3 feet away, his face a pale reflection of his sister's. He reached out as if to touch her arm, then pulled back, his hand hovering in midair as he read the clause highlighted in red. The veto didn't just disqualify a board member. It stripped the inheritance of any heir found guilty of identity theft or the systematic defrauding of the estate. Aunt Beatrix sat perfectly still in the front row, her spine straight, her eyes bright with a justice long delayed. She didn't look at the screen. She looked only at Clara, a faint, knowing smile touching her lips. "It's a lie," Eleanor whispered, the sound carrying through the silent hall. "It's a fake. I am the CEO. I am the blood heir." "The DNA results on page 4 say otherwise," Clara said, her voice calm and steady, amplified by the microphone she hadn't even realized she was holding. "And the forensic audit on page 12 shows exactly whose social security number you used to open the offshore accounts. You spent years telling me I was a guest in this house, Eleanor. You spent years treating me like a charity case, while you lived off the interest of a life you stole." The socialites in the third row leaned away, their whispers turning into a low, buzzing roar of condemnation. The smell of spilled, expensive champagne rose from the floor, cloying and sour. Mr. Henderson turned his back on the podium, signaling the board members to follow him toward the exit. Clara stepped up to the podium, looking down at the woman who had spent a decade trying to erase her. She didn't feel the need to shout. She didn't feel the need to gloat. The silence of the room was the only weapon she needed. "You said power was a birthright, Eleanor," Clara said, leaning in close so only the woman in the ruined gown could hear the finality in her tone. "You were right. You just forgot whose birthright it was. You have until tomorrow morning to vacate the Sterling estate. Security will be there at 8 to change the locks." Without waiting for a response, Clara turned and walked toward the grand mahogany doors. She didn't look back at the wreckage. She didn't look at Julian's pleading eyes or the way Eleanor had collapsed onto her knees amidst the broken glass. As she stepped out into the cool night air, the heavy doors swung shut behind her, sealing the elite inside with the truth they had spent a lifetime trying to ignore. The cool night air hit Clara's face, but the heat of the ballroom still pulsed behind her like a dying star. She stood on the gravel driveway of the Sterling estate, the silence of the evening punctuated only by the distant, frantic shouting echoing from behind the mahogany doors she had just exited. The transition from the suffocating scent of lilies and expensive perfume to the crisp smell of upcoming rain was a mercy she hadn't realized she needed. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds before the doors burst open again. Julian Sterling stumbled out first, his silk tie loosened and his face a mask of sweating desperation. He scanned the driveway until his eyes landed on her. "Clara, Clara, wait!" He jogged toward her, his polished shoes crunching loudly on the stones. "We can talk about this. The veto, it's a technicality, surely. We're family. We can settle this quietly without the lawyers." Clara didn't turn around. She watched the headlights of a black sedan sweep across the manicured lawn as it pulled toward the front circle. "We were never family, Julian," she said, her voice as steady as the mountain air. "I was an auditor you hired to hide your sins, and a sister you used as a shield. That contract ended the moment I saw the forged signatures on the trust." "You're being emotional," he hissed, reaching out to grab her arm. A shadow moved from the side of the idling sedan. Marcus Thorne stepped into the light, the sharp, metallic click of his briefcase latch echoing like a gunshot in the quiet night. He didn't say a word, but the sheer predatory stillness of the man made Julian freeze mid-step. The lawyer adjusted his cufflink, the silver catching the moonlight, and stood beside Clara like a silent sentinel. Then came the sound Clara had been waiting for, the sharp, rhythmic strike of heels on marble, followed by a jagged, uneven stumble. Eleanor Sterling appeared in the doorway, and for the first time in 20 years, the Ice Queen looked human and utterly defeated. Her features didn't just fall, they seemed to dissolve under the weight of the overhead portico lights. The sharp, aristocratic line of her jaw, usually held with such practiced defiance, began to tremor uncontrollably, making her look decades older in an instant. Her skin, once porcelain and perfect, had taken on a sickly, grayish hue that made her expensive rouge look like a fresh bruise against her cheekbones. Her eyes, usually cold and calculating, darted around the driveway with the frantic energy of a trapped animal, losing their focus as the reality of the veto stripped away her status, her wealth, and her very name in a single breath. Her breath came in ragged, audible hitches, and the hand she reached out to steady herself against the stone pillar was shaking so violently that her diamond cocktail ring clattered against the masonry. "You won't get away with this," Eleanor rasped, her voice cracking. "That house, those accounts, they belong to the Sterling name, and I am the only Sterling left with a clean hand to hold them," Aunt Beatrix said, appearing behind her. The elderly matriarch looked at her niece with a mixture of pity and profound disgust. She handed a small, leather-bound folder to Marcus. "The original ledgers, Marcus. The ones Eleanor thought were lost in the 2018 fire." Eleanor let out a sound that was half sob, half snarl. "You traitor! You've lived off my generosity for years. Your generosity was bought with Clara's stolen inheritance, the older woman replied, her voice echoing with a newfound strength. I am simply returning the stolen goods to their rightful owner. The board members began to spill out of the house now, a stream of dark suits and shimmering gowns. Mr. Henderson, the board chair who had laughed at Clara's modest dress only an hour before, stepped forward. He didn't even look at Eleanor as he passed her. He walked straight to Clara, his posture bent in a sudden, frantic display of professional submission. Ms. Vance, Henderson began, his voice oily and eager. We had no idea of the extent of the irregularities. The board is prepared to vote for an immediate restructuring. We'd like to invite you to a private session tomorrow morning to discuss your vision for the firm. Clara felt the rough texture of the velvet interior of the car door as Marcus opened it for her. She looked at Henderson, then at the circle of witnesses who had watched her be humiliated for years. The vision is simple, Mr. Henderson. I'm firing the entire board by noon tomorrow. You'll receive your severance packages, minus the bonuses you took from the diverted accounts. She turned her gaze back to Eleanor, who was now clutching the stone pillar as if it were the only thing keeping her from sinking into the earth. The woman's perfect coiffure had come undone, a single strand of hair whipping across her face in the rising wind. I told you I had a steel trap memory, Eleanor, Clara said softly. I remembered every insult, every charity dress, every time you told me I didn't belong in this world. She paused, letting the sound of the idling engine fill the space between them. I've already frozen the Sterling primary accounts. 10 minutes ago, the bank flagged every transaction you made in the last 48 hours as suspicious. You won't be taking the jewelry tonight. It's listed as company collateral. Eleanor's mouth opened, but only a dry, rattling gasp came out. She watched, paralyzed, as two men in dark suits, Clara's security team, stepped past her into the house to begin the lockdown. Clara slid into the back of the sedan. As Marcus closed the door, the scent of expensive leather and citrus cologne enveloped her, a stark contrast to the wreckage on the porch. The car began to roll forward, the gravel crunching under the tires. Through the tinted glass, Clara saw a lone figure standing by the estate gates. It was a man in a plain suit holding a stack of legal envelopes. As the car passed through the gates, the process server stepped forward toward the house, where the lights were already beginning to flicker out, one wing at a time. Clara leaned back and closed her eyes. The reckoning had only just begun, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't the one who had to be afraid of the dark. 6 months had passed since the lights went out at the Sterling estate. The air in the new high-rise office smelled of lemon verbena and fresh ink, a sharp departure from the suffocating scent of lilies that had once defined Clara's life. Clara Vance sat behind a desk of reclaimed oak, watching the morning fog roll off the city skyline. The sleeping lion was no longer a metaphor. She was the architect of a new legacy. The Vance Foundation was now the majority stakeholder in the very firms Julian had nearly bled dry. And the forensic audit she had spearheaded was already being cited in legal textbooks as a masterclass in corporate justice. The door opened, and Marcus Thorne stepped in, carrying a single manila folder. He looked different without the combat-ready tension of the trial. He looked satisfied. The final liquidation is complete, he said, placing the folder on the oak surface. The court-ordered restitution has cleared. Every cent taken from your parents' trust has been recovered with interest. Clara didn't feel the rush of adrenaline she had expected. Instead, there was only a profound, quiet stillness. And the sentencing. Julian accepted the plea deal. 3 years for his role in the wire fraud, he replied, his voice steady. As for Eleanor, she's waiting in the lobby. She refused to sign the final surrender of the personal property unless she spoke to you. Security is with her, of course. Clara stood, smoothing the fabric of her charcoal suit. It wasn't a designer label meant to intimidate. It was hers, bought with her own salary, not a charity allowance. She walked toward the glass-walled conference room where a woman sat huddled in a chair that seemed far too large for her. Eleanor Sterling looked like a charcoal sketch of her former self. The Ice Queen had thawed into something brittle and gray. Her hair, once a masterpiece of platinum precision, was pulled back in a limp ponytail, showing roots that hadn't seen a stylist in months. She wore a wool coat that was pilling at the sleeves, and her hands, stripped of the heavy diamonds that had been her armor, shook as she gripped a cheap plastic handbag. When Clara entered, the woman didn't sneer. She didn't demand. She looked up with eyes that were sunken and rimmed with a desperate, frantic red. The arrogance had been replaced by a hollow, gnawing fear. "You have the papers," Clara said, her voice like a calm, cold tide. I wanted to ask about the sapphire pendant," Eleanor whispered. Her voice, once so sharp it could cut glass, was now a dry rattle. "It wasn't part of the corporate collateral. It was a gift from Julian's father. Please." "It's all I have left of that life." Clara looked at the woman who had once poured wine over her head and called her a parasite. She remembered the nights spent shivering in the drafty guest wing while her adoptive family laughed in the ballroom. She remembered the identity theft that had nearly erased her existence. "It wasn't a gift," Clara said, leaning over the table. The smell of Eleanor's cheap drugstore perfume was a visceral reminder of how far the mighty had fallen. "He bought that pendant with a dividend check from my father's estate. It was never his to give, and it was never yours to wear. It has been catalogued for the museum collection." The silence in the room was absolute. Eleanor's mouth opened, a small, pathetic sound escaping her throat. She looked at the pen on the table as if it were a weapon. With a hand that trembled violently, she scrawled her name on the final surrender document. The Sterling legacy ended with that jagged, desperate signature. "You've taken everything," Eleanor croaked, looking at her reflection in the polished glass. "I have nothing, no home, no status. Julian won't even take my calls from the facility. He blames me for the audit." "You have exactly what you gave me for 20 years, Clara replied, picking up the folder. "The truth. I suggest you learn how to live with it." She walked out before the woman could respond. She didn't stay to watch the security guard escort the former socialite to the elevator. She didn't need to see the final collapse. Later that evening, Clara returned to the Sterling estate, now the Vance Memorial Library and Archive. The renovations were nearly complete. The heavy drapes were gone, replaced by soaring glass that let in the moonlight. Aunt Beatrix was waiting for her in the foyer, sitting in her wheelchair near the portrait of Clara's biological parents that had finally been moved from the attic to the place of honor above the hearth. "It's done, then?" Beatrix asked, her voice soft with age. "It's done," Clara said, resting a hand on the older woman's shoulder. She looked up at the portrait. Her mother's smile was kind, her father's eyes full of a life that had been stolen too soon. Clara had won. She had the house, the money, and the name. But as she stood in the vast, echoing foyer, the cost settled into her bones. She had spent her youth fighting a war she never asked for. She had lost the illusion of family, and the scars of Eleanor's cruelty would always be part of her architecture. Justice was a cold meal. It was satisfying, and it was necessary, but it didn't fill the silence of the rooms. Clara turned toward the window, watching the gates close. For the first time, she wasn't hiding, and she wasn't waiting for the blow to fall. She was simply herself, standing in the light of a house that finally belonged to the right person.
I hope you enjoyed this wild story. Don't forget to subscribe for more. See you in the next one.